Hey everyone, hope everyone's doing well and staying safe these days. So I actually want to do a motherboard review here, of course also including an installation and unboxing, and a bit of a BIOS overview as much as I possibly can. And this board I have here today is from ASUS, the Prime Z690-P, and this actually is the DDR4 variant. There's actually a DDR5 variant of this particular board as well too, as of course 12th generation Intel CPUs want to actually encourage using DDR5 memory chips, but unfortunately DDR5 memory chips are still a little bit pricey, and up until just a few weeks ago it was even a little bit scarce to find. So there is actually the DDR4 variant as well too, so we'll be reviewing that. Let's go ahead and pop this open and take a look here. Before we go ahead and actually unbox this, let me actually take a look, as usual, of the back of the box here, so you can get a little bit more information on this particular board here. Here, of course, is a nice little shot of the board with a little bit of a shot on the side as well too, with all the back connections on the back plate. And of course, some little details down here. Obviously, one thing that really does stand out is the PCI Generation 5. The slot is right over here. Looks like some little option here for memory optimization, some extra protection features on this particular board against maybe static or over voltage and some other stuff. And back here looks like a flexible M2 heatsink. That's actually kind of interesting. Let me see if I can actually get my hands on that as well too. These little heatsinks are actually will cover over and keep the M2 drives nice and cool. Particularly up here, you can actually see it. And sometimes they're a little bit questionable. Some people have actually said that they really just are counterproductive, and they actually keep the drive a little even warmer than they really should be, causing being the issue of throttling and causing throttling as well too. Let's go ahead and get this opened up. ASUS usually likes to put this little flap here that usually keeps one or two little bits of cables, but in this case I'm going to probably take a guess that it's probably their Wi-Fi antenna. Here it is. Of course, the little Wi-Fi antenna. Once we move that out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the board itself. So let's go ahead and just lift this up ever so carelessly. Move that out of the way. Here's the box within the box feature, which is pretty useful to protect all the stuff underneath on the board itself. And of course, down here looks like we do have two SATA ports, two SATA cables right here. Looks like you do have a separate backplate I/O shield on this particular board. I was actually hoping it would be built in, but in this case it's actually not. We have of course, your manual here that you'll probably be using just for a little bit of looking through, just some stuff, and of course finding out where those front panel connections are on this particular board. A little CD with drivers. Many manufacturers have actually started to include little USB thumb drives. I'm not sure how usually how big they are, maybe about a gig or so, just enough to actually get your chipset and other drivers left on there. Since CDs are obviously not becoming really popular these days, not many computers these days even have optical drives. And of course, looks like a couple little screws here for your M2 drive or M2 related, and of course another one here. So looks like that's pretty much it. A little bit of a weight to this particular board, not too much. It actually does weigh a little bit less than higher end boards as well. A little bit of a tape here. Go ahead and take this off so we can get the anti-static bag removed from this particular board. Ow, looks like this particular board just bit me too. Gotta be really careful of those pins underneath. And here's the board itself. Looking at it with this little plate up here, honestly from the picture, it really did look like this board actually had the backplate I/O shield built in, but that's unfortunately a little bit misleading. So just try to keep that in mind if you are very, very picky about this, and I definitely am. This particular board does not have the built-in feature here, but just because if you're looking at it like this, it really looks like it will. So definitely try to get some other shots just before you actually pick up a board and make a mistake yourself. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the connections on the board itself here. It looks like we have a number of USB connections here. It looks like about 6 of them. 1, 2, Run over here, there's another USB-C connection here, and of course an additional 2 USB 3 connections. If you are using integrated graphics on your Intel CPU, you'll be using these 2 connections over here. Looks like 1 DisplayPort and 1 HDMI as well too. Not to be missed here, which is a little bit unique and rare on ASUS motherboards, looks like a PS2 port over here. Obviously a little bit of a purple for keyboard, a little bit of a green for mouse. You can actually use it for either both of them. And I know there's an adapter that can be used as a splitter as well too. I'm not even sure if I've seen one of those in some time. Moving along here, looks like we do have a Ethernet port connection on this right over here. We do have your audio connections here, including an optical connection down here. Here, of course, is your regular green color-coded stereo connection. And as I mentioned, the little Wi-Fi antenna. Here, of course, are your connections for your Wi-Fi over here. Let's go ahead and start taking a look at the other connections on this particular board. So right off the back, looks like on the bottom here, we do have audio from panel connections in this area here. Right over here is a different comm system connection here that's actually used. Right next to it, looks like we do have 2 4-pin fan connections. You actually see that there. And just hiding here right underneath the PCI Express slot right above, it actually does look like there's a Thunderbolt Thunderbolt connection up here for front panel use. These are becoming much more popular and being used with modern day motherboards as well too, as they really start really working together with USB 3 Type-C connections. So these are actually really popular to actually have. Right next to them, looks like we have 2 USB 2 port connections here, very old-fashioned here. And these are actually pretty useful if you do have a computer component, such as a power supply that does have monitoring software on it, and will actually need to be connected to the board using one of these connections, not to suck up a USB 3 port connection. Speaking of which, here of course is your front panel USB 3 connection here. This will actually support 3.2 speeds, I believe. And right over here, looks like we do have our front panel connections, including our 4-pin fan as well, computer speaker connection here. So obviously the manual, definitely pretty useful to find out which connections go where. Up here, looks like we have 4 SATA ports. They like to put 2 down here and then 2 on the side, but looks like all 4 of them are actually on the lower right corner, so they can be accessible whether from the bottom or from the right side of the motherboard. Right over here, looks like we have 2 3-pin RGB LED connections here. Definitely useful if you'll actually be using that for some colors on your motherboard. Standing out here, something I actually don't cover too much is a little TPM connection here. This is obviously something that a lot of people really went frantic about when Windows 11 mentioned that they'll be requiring TPM chips on the motherboards. Not really thinking too much that many other motherboards actually already have it, just has not been turned on. So just something to take a look here. Moving along, obviously very, very essential and very useful these days, a USB Type-C connection for your front panel. Very useful over here. And one more additional USB 3 front panel connection here as well too. Sitting right next to that is your 24-pin motherboard power connection, something that just hasn't changed in over a decade, I believe. Maybe they did add the additional 4 pins here, but still the same connection. Right next to that, we have another 4-pin fan connection, system fan connection here, and 2 more additional RGB connections. One's a 3-pin and one's a 4-pin here. Looking above, we do have 4 DIMM slots. Obviously, these are color-coded to make it easier for dual channel use. You see your gray over here, the ideal connection here for your memory slot, chips that you actually be using for dual channel mode. Up here, we do have a dedicated CPU fan connection and another fan connection here that possibly can be used for pump fans. Basically, if you have water cooling on this particular system, you can go ahead and connect that to one of these 2, depending on which one you actually have. Looking over here, we do have your CPU connections here, CPU power connections, the 1 8-pin and 1 4-pin. Ideally, you have to have the 8-pin connected. Doesn't hurt to actually have the 4-pin connected as well too. I usually actually say this when it comes to Ryzen motherboards. You actually do not need both of them connected unless you're planning to overclock or use a CPU that's probably 125 watts or more. This board does have PCI Express Generation 5 on this slot, this section here. You can actually see that, pretty heavy duty protection on it as well too. Right above, you do have your M2, which is actually running at Generation 4 speed. So if you only have one M2 NVMe drive on this particular system, this is the ideal slot for it. Kind of feel this to have like a little bit of an aluminum kind of feeling, which is nice because it's actually supposed to be used as kind of like a heat sink. Can't really feel the flex on that, but I guess once I remove it, I can definitely feel that. Of course, you do have some additional PCI X16 slots here that are running at either Generation 4 or Generation 3, very likely Generation 3. Ideally, you want to use this Generation 5 slot up here. And in this section here, it looks like you do have another M2 NVMe slot right over here as well too. A couple of little fan screw holes over here, depending how large the drive is actually here. So 1, 2, 3. I think even 4 over here. There's another little heatsink that's not included in this box, but if you were to actually use this, you can definitely bring this heatsink plate down here if you wanted to. You do have that option. Up here, it looks like we do have our socket 1700 Intel CPU socket in this area with a little protection plastic piece on top, as usual, to protect the pins inside. Intel CPUs these days are pinless, and all the pins are actually on the motherboard itself to prevent damage on the CPU itself. So that's a quick overview of this particular motherboard. Pretty good, solid feeling to it, but a little bit more of a budget side as well too. So it definitely has all the connections you actually may actually need. Thunderbolt, USB-C Type-C, USB 3 Type-C up there. A couple of little less SATA ports than usual, but as I mentioned in other videos as well too, SATA ports are just becoming a little bit more unpopular these days, unless of course you do have 1 or 2 mechanical hard drives. Most of the main SSDs are now being used on chips on these little M2 slots here. Well, let's go ahead and toss this into a case, get a CPU installed, and we'll take a look at the BIOS. Alright, so our system is actually booted up and ready to go. I've actually gone into the BIOS here. You can already see a lot of basically basic settings here that you would normally see when entering any BIOS. This is actually the easy mode view at the moment. Many other manufacturers also have very similar easy and also an advanced mode. You can actually see down here little hotkeys to click on F7 to bounce between the two, or just go ahead and click on here to just go ahead and switch between both modes as well. I'm going to go ahead and just follow through a little bit of an overview here through the easy mode, and also right next to that the advanced mode as well too. So first off, you actually do see here a date and time, some other options here for language, search for a particular option. This will take you also over to the option for LED control on anything connected to those little RGB connections on this particular motherboard. And of course, another little option here for just resizing some option here as well. Just below here, you do see your basic information for your motherboard, your BIOS version. The current CPU that's actually installed, you can see this is a 12th generation Intel i3, Core i3 12100F CPU, 4-core, 8-thread CPU. You currently also do see the current clock speed of that CPU, and of course your memory, total memory, and clock speed of the memory. This motherboard uses DDR4 memory over DDR5, but of course there is a variant of this motherboard that does use DDR5 as well. Just below here, you do actually see XMP. To go ahead and switch between the profiles you actually have built into the memory chips here. And this obviously allows you to use optimize settings that these memory chips, these particular G-Skill memory chips actually have. You also do see if there's any particular drives plugged into this particular system. In this case, we do have one little SSD on the SATA port. So you can actually see the information here, as opposed to also seeing which SATA port it's currently using. Just below here, also do see the option for Intel Rapid Storage technology that's actually currently off. I can actually go ahead and turn it on here, considering that this SSD drive does support it. Now a little bit lower here on the left side, you do see the current fans that are connected to the motherboard here, and you can actually see the CPU fan plus the two chassis fans or system fans that are connected here. Kind of a little cute little option here. The little icon here does spin a little bit faster when it's actually the RPM is actually higher, so you can see this little CPU fan spinning a little bit faster than these chassis fans here right now. Obviously, if they're currently disconnected or off, you will not see any activity here. On the middle side, right over here, you can see the current CPU fan speed here, RPM, compared to the temperature of the CPU. And you can click on this little button here, where you can go ahead and manipulate the thresholds between the CPU temperature and the fan RPM speed, depending on which you prefer to use. You actually do have the option for basic modes here: silent, turbo, full speed, and of course something that many people probably want to use is manual. To go ahead and select between all the fans, you can just click on these little options here and just go ahead and make the changes you need. Just above all that, you can actually see here in the middle section the current CPU temperature at 39 degrees Celsius. I do have to admit how a little bit complicated to some degree getting that generic CPU stock cooler installed, and I say that because I did actually have it installed, and at one point the CPU temperature began to spike. Turns out the CPU heatsink was actually not fully installed, so just be really careful if you actually install in stock coolers or any other very similar Intel coolers using those little 4 pins on the back. I don't think I had a really good contact with the CPU, and I started seeing the temperature spike up to like 60 degrees Celsius and above, which is a no-go, especially if you're just browsing around the BIOS. Up here, you also do see some other generic information like current CPU voltage. I can definitely look into that, go into that a little bit, how you can go ahead and manipulate those in overclocking settings. And now over here on the right side, you have a little bit of options here for easy system tuning. This actually can give you a little bit of like a preferred power setting. You can actually go ahead and click on all that. You can actually see here. I'll just leave it on normal for the time being. Below, you do have a quick option here to go ahead and select your boot priority. And right over here, you do see the main SSD that currently has Windows 11 installed on this. So you actually will see that labeled as a Windows Boot Manager. If you had other drives here, you can probably be seeing all those options as well too. If you go ahead and click on F8, you will see the option to go ahead and select other boot devices, such as a USB thumb drive, if there was actually one plugged in, and have the information to actually go ahead and boot up. That's pretty much a quick overview of the easy mode here. Just below, you do have the option to go ahead and reset back to default, and of course F10, save and exit, and basically just leave the BIOS and save and exit all the changes you've actually just made. I'm going to go ahead and click on F7 here just to go ahead and bounce over to advanced mode. Under advanced mode, you immediately notice there's much more information than easy mode actually offered. You do actually see the full motherboard name here, the BIOS build date, other information, current speed here, base frequency, and other options as well too. You also do have the option to change the language and of course edit and set the date and time. On the right side, you do see some more information that we saw a little bit earlier, just a good summary of your CPU, memory, and everything involving voltage regarding all three of them as well too. Just before we continue here, I just want to go ahead and just take a quick look at the menu just above. You do see the option again to change the language, the little My Favorites button over here. And once you actually click on that, you do have the option to go ahead and drag and remove any options in the motherboard here if you actually want to go ahead and have some readily available under a favorites menu, and I'll show you that in just a moment. You can go ahead and just click on which setting you'd like to go ahead and keep there and just drag it over into my favorites and shortcuts section. You currently see these options here are your current favorites. I can go ahead and remove some as well too, and go ahead and add some more as well. Connected to the My Favorites is this little My Favorites button over here on the left. And you can actually see all these settings that are actually in that list. If you've actually added some more, you will see them here as well too. So these are basically all the favorite settings. So obviously none of them probably have nothing to do with each other, or they might, depending exactly what you prefer to have here. I actually find this to be very useful and a very welcome change in this BIOS here. And of course, I believe other manufacturers are starting to adopt this particular little option here as well. Clicking over to AI Tweaker, it looks like we do have some options here regarding overclocking. So obviously you do see the base temperature of the frequency for the memory, the CPU, and of course you do have many other options here to go ahead and manipulate those settings here. Bear in mind, a lot of these settings have to do with overclocking, so definitely know what you're doing before you make any changes here. You may unfortunately damage your hardware, your CPU, your memory, and other options here as well too. This memory is actually rated at 3000 speed, so somewhere here you'll see the setting to actually go ahead and make that change for the memory speed as well. There's other options here for voltage and frequency settings, so again, be very wary of making these changes. Know what you're doing before you make all these changes here. Here, of course, is the memory frequency. I can go ahead and set that up to 3000 or something really close to it. Click on Advanced. You do have some further options here. Of course, you can see many options here. CPU configuration. So these are basically giving you some settings here, giving you some options for hyper-threading, virtualization, and other options that the CPU has built in. Some CPUs may have other options built in, and you'll be seeing all those extra changes reflected in settings when that CPU is actually installed. You do see some further options here regarding your motherboard and your system, memory configuration, as you can see here. I'm going to go ahead and click on this one as well too. This is a really small one, but pretty relevant if you want to just take a look at it regarding PCI Express link speeds. Here's another one regarding your M2 and NVMe slots as well. One below here looks like this is actually connected to the Thunderbolt configuration as well, giving you some options here for tunneling over USB 4. And of course, something really important when it comes to Windows 11, your trusted computing, TPM 2.0. Obviously, it by default is currently set to enable. Of course, you can go ahead and disable that or make any other changes you'd like to do. Some options here for PCI subsystem settings. Sometimes you don't really have to navigate here, but these options are actually here. USB configuration can be a little bit important, so you do have some options here regarding legacy and other handling of USB connections. Of course, you do see a setting here for network stack. And finally, another little option here for NVMe settings as well too. There's no current drive installed on this particular motherboard, so this setting is currently not available. Scrolling down, we do actually see some more settings. You do have the hard drive SSD smart information to kind of give you a little bit of a view or a preview if there's imminent failure on one of those hard drives coming up, something you want to avoid for sure. APM settings here for power. Onboard device configuration, so if you want to go ahead and disable or enable current devices built into this particular motherboard, such as the LAN or audio card, you do have these options here as well. And one last little setting, since I actually did turn it on, this is Intel Rapid Storage technology. It does recognize my, well actually currently it does not recognize any drives that actually use this particular feature, but if it did, you would actually see that there. Moving along to the next setting here, we do have this little monitor button here, which is basically giving you very similar settings to the Q fan control. You can actually see here temperature monitors. You can see basically here a temperature monitor for motherboard, CPU, and other. Down here you do see fan speed monitors as well too. Voltage monitors, and of course Q fan configuration, taking you right back to very similar older fashioned settings here for your fan controls as well. Obviously, you may find this little Q fan control up here a little bit more useful to you and a little bit more easier to actually manipulate. Moving along here, you do see the option for boot. This is basically where you can go ahead and set up your boot mode here. Obviously, you do have the CSM, UEFI settings up here. And below here, you do have the option to go ahead and select your boot device. Obviously, we do have this SSD with Windows 11 installed on it. And of course, you actually do see below the other drives that currently have an operating system ready to boot up in. Clicking on boot configuration here, you do see some more options regarding fast boot, showing now the logo here, and other little options here regarding your boot device. Moving along a little further to the right, you do have this little tool option, which gives you some more options that are actually built into this motherboard from ASUS themselves. You do have the Easy Flash utility to go ahead and update the BIOS, or even roll back to a previous one as well too. Obviously, you do have some other options regarding ASUS Secure Erase, basically connected with your SSD or other drives as well too, if you want to go ahead and wipe them out. Very similar to like some old-fashioned software like Blanco. May actually go ahead and assist you here. ASUS user profile, speed information, Armory Crate, and of course my ASUS. This little app here, if you go ahead and download it and have it on your phone, you can actually go ahead and manipulate some settings here off the phone itself, or actually just keep track of what's going on with this motherboard. Some people find this little option here to be a little creepy, but you can definitely look into it and actually go ahead and see if it's suitable for you. Clicking on exit, the last button here, you do have the option to go ahead and save your changes. Load optimize defaults, which is obviously something that I usually sometimes go here when I make some changes and I just want to go right back to the same defaults. Or just go ahead and discard any changes you've made and just exit the BIOS and reboot. So for the most part, that's actually pretty much it for a quick overview of the entire BIOS. You definitely can go on to each setting, particularly the AI tweaker. Much more thorough settings here to look into, but again, be very careful what changes you're actually making. These have to do with really deep settings on the CPU and the motherboard, and you definitely don't want to go ahead and change something that may actually cause any damage or issues with your board or your CPU. On the bottom here, you do have this little button that says last modified. If you actually go ahead and click here, you'll see a list of all the changes you've actually made in the BIOS itself. Kind of curious that the little setting change I made to the memory speed does not actually show up here, but you should definitely be seeing the list of any setting changes you've made in this list there. Just to demonstrate here, obviously no issue booting into Windows 11. Let me just go ahead and actually just bring up system information here so you can actually just see the motherboard's name. And over here, you can actually see, sorry if the letters are kind of small, you can actually see all the details here regarding this particular board here. Seems like it doesn't really give me the entire board name. It does give me the details on the CPU. And of course, here's a ASUS name here. Try and take a look at the board itself in action. So this board actually does not have any RGB colors built onto the board, such as some other manufacturers may have. I'm sure maybe higher tier versions of this particular board or chipset will have that particular option. Usually there's some colors on this area, maybe over the little heatsink near the backplate I/O shield, or possibly on the bottom, but in this case there's actually none. The only colors I see is coming from the video card and the two memory chips over here. Try to get a little bit closer, and you can actually hear that pretty quiet system for the most part. CPU fan is actually not running anywhere near crazy speeds, and the CPU I believe is probably running around 4 to 4.1 gigahertz at this time. Little iCore 3 65-watt CPU. Anyway, hope everyone enjoyed this quick video, and also the unboxing installation of the motherboard, and a quick overview of the BIOS as well too. Definitely shoot a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Definitely would really appreciate if you support the channel. And of course, let me know if you have any questions regarding this motherboard in particular, the settings or features it may actually have, and if you are currently using this board yourself and how things are going pretty well with it or having any issues. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and as always, stay safe. Take care.